Transform your business with Microsoft Azure, the one-stop shop for everything cloud and AI. With Azure Migrate and Modernize, move your existing workloads to Azure with ease. With Azure Innovate, build new solutions with focused and deep engagement. Their core offerings provide comprehensive resources, expert assistance, and cost optimization tools. Accelerate your cloud journey and stay ahead of the competition with Microsoft Azure. Visit aka.ms/Azure Hero Offerings to learn more. That's aka.ms/Azure Hero Offerings to learn more.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. We are getting towards the end of November 2023. Thanksgiving weekend finishing up here in the United States. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Hope everybody is thankful or had an opportunity to spend some time with friends and family. Be thankful for the things around you. I want to do sort of a slightly different type of Sunday Perspective show. We're going to do two things in this show. The first little segment, we're going to do the first, 3-4 minute segment. We're going to do a quick recap of what happened with OpenAI. Aaron and I were going to do a much bigger kind of breakdown of what happened. I think given the fact that we're not exactly sure what happened. I mean, we sort of know the little bit of tidbits and headlines. We're going to hold that till probably a little bit. We're going to let some things shake out and see what sort of happens. We're going to do a quick recap of what happened with the OpenAI coup, if you will. And then we're going to do kind of part two of this, what happened with the big, ups and downs that we've had over the last 20 or so years. So last week's show, we did a long breakdown of the dotCom bubble. This time we're going to do kind of what happened between the dotCom bubble and the housing bubble crash of 2008, because there was a whole bunch of interesting technology that evolved in that space. Some interesting companies, some interesting business trends that happen in that space. And that'll lead us up to the third part, which will be probably next week, looking at kind of how we got from 2008, the housing crash, all the way to basically the COVID timeframe and sort of through 2022, 2023, and all the things that happened there. So anyways, real quick on the OpenAI stuff, really, really interesting. A week or so ago, OpenAI held their first OpenAI Dev Day. It seemed to go very, very well, was well perceived by the industry. Sam Altman, the CEO, was very prominent. Didn't seem to be a lot of backlash. Interesting new technologies evolved. And then less than a week later, there is this just random email or tweet that comes out that says Sam Altman, CEO and a founder essentially of OpenAI, has been fired by the board for really kind of undisclosed reasons. Essentially, they said he was not, I don't know if they explicitly said truthful, but not forthcoming in his communication or some pattern of lack of forthcomingness. And what was really interesting is I think this was, for anybody who doesn't spend all day long studying OpenAI, was sort of the first time that people realized a couple of things. One, that somehow a guy who was this powerful at a company that was becoming very powerful didn't have complete control of his board, which is kind of unusual. Number two was the unusual kind of situation at OpenAI between this nonprofit, essentially how OpenAI is set up. There is a nonprofit organization of which the nonprofit basically runs the board. And then there has been recently, over the last few years, sort of a for-profit arm that's been created that's still sort of parallel to or controlled by the same board. So I think a lot of us learned about the corporate governance around OpenAI. What was interesting was not only did the board fire him, but as part of that, also like the chief scientist, a guy named Ilya, whose last name I won't pronounce. Anyways, they got fired like on a Friday night. By like Saturday morning at like 3 a.m, Microsoft, who is the largest investor, about a 49% holder, came out and said that we are shocked by the news. Apparently they weren't told ahead of time, but they also said we are willing to hire everybody from OpenAI into this newly created division at Microsoft. Essentially, they were like, hey, if you all want to follow the leader, we will basically fund it. And so that was an interesting roughly 24 hours of everybody saying, wow, Microsoft just essentially acqui-hired all of OpenAI for essentially zero. A document went around in which about 700 or basically all of the employees of OpenAI essentially said, we're going to quit unless you they sent a letter to the board and said, we're essentially going to quit unless you reinstate Sam Altman and the other guy who was the chairman of the company, or the president of the company, excuse me, not chairman, who had also quit, another founder. So anyways, it was another 24, 72 hour, 48 hours or so of kind of lots of speculation over what happened. Why did he actually get fired? What terrible thing had he done? They actually named a original interim CEO who was formerly the CTO. Then about 24 hours later, they named the former founder of Twitch to be the new CEO. He, again, was sort of kind of like the real CEO. He wasn't sort of an interim CEO. That lasted all of about a day. And then he was actually part of the negotiation along with the chief scientist, who sent out a tweet that said, I'm really sorry that I did the coup. I really didn't mean to screw up the whole company. And then eventually, and of course, Microsoft sort of got involved, and there's lots of, hearsay about who all was involved. But essentially now, Sam Altman and the former president are back at OpenAI. They all sent out some tweets saying, hey, we're back. They essentially got rid of the old board, and except for the one guy who was CEO of Quora, which is a really kind of weird thing because he also has another company that is not really competitive, but in the ecosystem along with OpenAI. So anyways, net, for about 4 days, OpenAI went from top of the world after their dev day. They fired their CEO. They essentially had sort of a weird coup that happened. Essentially, the way it was perceived was the people who at the company are governing the company from the nonprofit were more concerned about the safety and long-term I don't want to call it philanthropy, but sort of safety of OpenAI. They sort of butted heads with the more commercial side of the business, which Sam drives. They kicked him out, and then people freaked out. They quickly realized that everybody was on Team Sam. They all were threatening to leave. Microsoft was threatening to hire all of them, essentially, and start a new AI division. And then they figured out a way to work out their things. Seems like the old board essentially got kicked out, and we're back to kind of this, this is what OpenAI is. Now, it seems like Sam's in charge, and we'll sort of see where it goes from there. But lots and lots of unanswered questions. We were going to try and make sense of those in a further show. But for those of you that were looking for Cloudcast commentary on it, that's what happened. There was a coup. The coup sort of failed. The old saying of, if you're going to come for the king, you better not miss. Looks like they missed. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. Anyways, so after the break, we're going to dive into what happened essentially between the dot-com bubble crash and the housing market crash, about a 7-year period. Lots of interesting things in our world happened, especially kind of around the origins of cloud computing, if you will. And we'll dig into that right after the break.
This episode is supported by Code Comments, an original podcast from Red Hat. When you're working on a project and you leave behind a small note in the code, a code comment, to help others learn what isn't clear in the code? This podcast features technologists who've been through the tough tech transitions and share how their teams survived the journey. In each episode, Red Hat's Jamie Parker recounts the behind-the-scenes stories of experienced technologists from across the industry who share what they've learned from implementing new technologies. Episodes are available anywhere you listen to podcasts and at redhat.com/code comments podcast. Search for Code Comments in your favorite podcast player, and we'll also include a link in the show notes. Our thanks to Code Comments for their support.
Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into this sort of second in a 3-part series that was kicked off last week. Basically what happened with the dot-com bubble, what drove it, what created the bubble, what created the crash. We want to dive into sort of part 2 of that, which is what created the post-dot-com technology evolution. What were the driving factors in it? What happened? And then how much was, what was technology's role or what was technology's marketplace looking like as the housing bubble crashed, essentially the global economy in 2008. So I want to kind of dive into all that because these things aren't independent. They are all somewhat intertwined. And the reason we're doing these is a 3-part series. As we mentioned last week, somebody who wasn't around in the 2001 timeframe basically said, "Hey, what happened?" So we thought, as people who were around, that would be a good retrospective to do. And then we got to thinking about it, and we said, "Well, maybe we'll do this as a 3-part series, hit on kind of the 3 major crashes that we've had over the last 20 or so years." Because again, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot to sort of understand, kind of how technology evolves and how it's not always kind of boom originally. There's some ebbs and flows that happen. So anyways, let's dive into, I guess let's call it part 2, essentially, roughly 1999 origin stories, 2001 crash, all the way through 2008 to about 2010. So in terms of background, what was going on at the time, so obviously the internet bubble had crashed. Tons of companies had gone out of business. But the ramifications from a public perspective was you had a lot of people who had lost huge amounts of money in the stock market, whether that was in their stock market accounts or their 401k, their retirement accounts, and so on and so forth. So in general, you had a huge kind of lack of trust in a couple of things. Number one, a lack of trust in the technology market as a whole. So people were very, very hesitant to believe that all of the hype around the internet and all of the hype around technology companies was real. They sort of felt like, okay, we've been sold a bill of materials. This stuff doesn't really have any tangibility behind it. It can be boom and bust, and we want to try and avoid that, right? People get excited about the going up. They get crushed by the downside, not just economically, but also emotionally, right? It's very, very hard to regain that trust. So you had a lot of people who lost faith in the market and technology. They're looking for alternative ways to invest because they had to plan for their retirement. They had to plan for other things in their life. Interest rates generally across the board, across the world, had dropped because governments were trying to attempt to recover from this boom and bust. So interest rates went from 7-8% in 2001-ish timeframe down to about 1.5%. So this is a theme that we've heard over and over again. When interest rates come way down, there are opportunities for new things to happen in the marketplace, obviously in terms of growth. So in essence, housing became the sort of safe investment for people. So you had a lot of people who quickly were like, well, of the money I have left for something that I want to grow, housing was essentially portrayed as a safe asset. It was an asset class that had continued to grow over time, hadn't necessarily been a skyrocket type of thing. It might have grown, 3%, 4%, 5%, 10% in certain markets during boom time and so forth. But it was considered to be a very safe asset and considered essentially to be an asset that always was going to go up. Now, how much it was going to go up, who knew? But, if you were going to, buy a house and keep it for X number of years, 20, 30 years, it had historically always gone up. And there really hadn't been any huge housing crashes over time. So that was kind of the framework of what we were looking at coming out of the 2000s and 2001. Technology was sort of out of favor. The internet was sort of out of favor, even though people had begun using it. Now, a couple of interesting things sort of happened because of the crash. One of them, and probably the most important of them, was that the huge amount of investment that had been put into fiber optics in the late 90s had essentially crashed because people went from, we are going to put the entire world of communications and business and economics and learning. And, the CEO of Cisco used to have this famous phrase, we're going to change the way that people live, work, play, and do something else. But essentially, like, everything was going to be on the internet, right? And then all of a sudden that idea crashed, or at least the prospect of it sort of crashed. And so all these companies that had made huge investments in fiber optic cabling, essentially everybody from energy companies and utility companies who had right-of-ways to railroad companies who had right-of-ways across the country to companies like Global Crossing and WorldCom and all these others who had just put billions and billions of dollars into fiber optic cable with the prospect of like unlimited bandwidth all over the place. We're going to run 600 internet TV channels and all these sort of things. Essentially all crashed. And so what you had was a little bit like what we have right now, or at least we did right after the crypto thing, but you had this glut of fiber in the ground that wasn't being used. And so what quickly began happening was some companies were able to buy it for literally pennies on the dollar. So companies like Switch, the data center company out in Las Vegas, Google was able to buy it at auction. There was a lot of companies that, some companies that were able to make, huge purchases without ever having to make the big capital investment. So you had this foundation in place that could be used for future things, right? So that was a big deal. You also had a couple of other things beginning to happen, right? So late 90s, early 2000, but late 90s, you started to have companies who were being created like NetSuite, Salesforce, LinkedIn, that were beginning to go, oh, we could create the business version of applications. So essentially a CRM system or an HR system or whatever it might be, financial backend systems. We could put those on the internet, and instead of having to make massive payments to an Oracle or an SAP or whoever it was at the time, you could start to buy these on a per seat basis and, on an on-demand basis. So in essence, the foundations of what became SaaS that we know today, the idea of per seat licensing, on-demand licensing, per month licensing, on-demand pricing, depending on how much you used, all kind of got created around the late 1990s, 2000 sort of time frame. And so you had a whole set of companies that were now going to basically start replacing or at least offering alternatives to your back end of your business from you didn't have to operate it and run it anymore. Essentially, their whole prospect was those things are no longer differentiators to your business. Therefore, why should you run them? We can give you a much more modern experience, right? So that was going on. The second thing that was going on was just this huge amount of kind of the sharing economy began. And so people were sharing all sorts of things from pictures to music, things like Napster, pictures, companies like Flickr and SmugMug. And, so you had a lot of that stuff going on. Essentially, how do I start sharing on the internet, if you will? And so the sharing economy sort of took off. And these were really interesting services because they were very large in scale, or at least seemed to be in scale. So they behind the scenes were inventing a bunch of new technologies around how do you do data management? How do you do file management? How do you build databases that scale in size, that you can grow in size? So this is where we start to see some of the open source technologies that eventually emerged later on start to get their origins, because we were getting into some use cases that were kind of different. So you started to have a lot of consumer experiences on the internet. Second Life, essentially for those of you that are younger, this is essentially Metaverse 1.0. So Second Life gets created in 2003. Napster, the music sharing company, got created in 1999 to basically pirate and share music all around the world. People started loving that idea. Apple launches the iPod. So Apple comes out of essentially financial ruin almost and introduces this computing device that fits in your pocket that is the precursor to the iPhone, but essentially holds 10 or 20 or 50 times or 1,000 times, I forget, maybe it was 1,000 times. It could hold like 1,000 songs. And before that, the best you could do was 20 or 30 songs on a tape cassette or something along those lines. So we were starting to get the beginning of sort of pocket computing technology. We were beginning to get all sorts of sharing on the internet. And then you start seeing the other really big thing that happened around this time frame was Google goes IPO in early parts of 2000, 2003, 2004. But essentially, Google figured out from all of the work they had done in scraping things off the internet, essentially building a search engine for the internet, that they were able to build an advertising business, which obviously we all sort of know and understand this today, but they essentially created the monetization model for the internet. So they were going to not only allow people to put ads on the internet, buy keywords and those types of things, or banner ads or whatever it was at the time, but they were then also going to allow you to put ads on your website. So you could find ways to monetize the things that you were doing without having to necessarily charge your customers. And so it became the beginning of this idea of, the internet is sort of free, if you will, and it's going to be paid for by advertising. And that obviously became and still is the most dominant form of sort of monetization on the internet. So you had a couple of things happen, right? You had people having learned the failed business models of the late 1990s. You had computing becomes cheaper because x86 and availability of open source things like Linux start to become more widely used. You have a monetization model that Google is behind that's available to basically everybody, every content creator, every photo sharing site, all those types of things. And you start to have this thing that's happening in which business usage types of things are now being put into the hands of consumers. So things like LinkedIn, put your resume online, Salesforce and all sorts of stuff. So you start to begin to have the beginning of what we called shadow IT. And shadow IT, the way to think about that is people started to become technology savvy at the end of 2000s or so. They were starting to get laptops and they were starting to have internet access at work and they were starting to get technology savvy a little bit. And then all of a sudden, some technology comes along in which they have access to applications that had been wildly expensive and only bought by the business were now sort of available to consumers or to a price point that didn't depend on your central IT. And so you started to have this idea of shadow IT groups that could say, hey, I'm technology savvy. My centralized group at work can't figure out how to make something work for me, but I want to go solve a business problem. And so you started to have the idea that people could figure out ways to essentially get around their IT departments, their enterprise groups, as long as they had access to the internet. And SaaS applications were helping with that. You started to have home technologies like home wireless companies like Linksys were starting to come along such that you could do computing from home off your couch easily. You could bring in a wireless device into the office and essentially do work from a conference room with 5 or 10 or extra people or whatever. So, this was the beginning of centralized IT, which had controlled all the budget, controlled all the security standards, had controlled all of the ways that people did things at work. And these sort of internet /SaaS consumer technologies were starting to make their way into the workplace. And this became a big deal. Obviously, the other thing that sort of happened at this time was we started seeing companies like a Google, for example, started kind of picking off these individual companies, right? So, for example, within about a 3 or 4 year period of them going IPO, they launched Gmail, so they dig into corporate email systems. They launch Maps, so digging into the entire mapping market and GPS market. They launch Earth. They launch Docs and Sheets, which essentially now is like Google Office, if you will. So they're going after that. They launch Calendar and they launch Android, so mobile phones. So Google quickly becomes this aggregating entity in which they're not just search, but they're trying to be all information to everybody. And they begin to become the company, or at least one of the companies, that people start saying, oh, okay, well, in the past, that startup launched and they do this one interesting thing, right? They're this SaaS service that does one interesting thing. And then very quickly, after about 3 or 4 years, once Google started launching these other services and they were essentially giving them away for free, it sort of began the culture of these aggregating platforms that they made their money by having more and more users on the platform, collecting more and more data that could potentially be cross-referenced by different services and so forth, that they could monetize through advertisement or monetize through search or whatever that might be. And it made it very difficult for new startups to essentially compete against that, because Google was essentially going to subsidize the entire business in order to, take in data, create data, do ads. And so you sort of got into this area where people talked about companies as being, well, they're not really a company, they're just a feature, and Google could replace them overnight. And then eventually, as the social world started to kick around, so you had these sort of sharing technologies, photo sharing and blogging was going on and other type of sharing. Then you had that sort of got put on steroids once the social media companies came out. So you had MySpace comes out in 2003, Facebook comes out in 2004, Twitter comes out in 2006. They become the aggregating technologies for not only social media, but kind of all of sharing, right? So Twitter, for example, comes along as micro-blogging, right? So blogging had been a thing. They were going to be micro-blogging. Facebook comes along and they've got the news feed, right? So all of a sudden it was like, well, why do I need these news sites like a Yahoo or MSNBC or whatever? I can just kind of find out about stuff that's customized to me in my news feed. And so you have a bunch of things going on that are just really kind of completely shaping how people think about the internet. Because all of a sudden it went from the only purpose of the internet is buying things, just kind of commercial retail transactions, to all of these interesting experiences that happened from 2000 to 2008 that are essentially free. And so the internet sort of becomes free as long as you can get on the internet. These services are pretty interesting, kind of compelling. They're very organized around sharing and social and communities. Wikipedia starts in 2001. So you have all those things sort of going on. Bandwidth is cheaper. Computing is cheaper. Operating systems like Linux are starting to emerge. MySQL databases and open source are starting to emerge. So you create a very different experience on the internet. And obviously people like that. Then they take that experience they have on the internet and they're wondering, well, if I get that at home or in my personal life, why don't I get that in my day-to-day work life? And so that begins to put a lot of pressure on enterprise IT organizations in order to figure out, like, how do I bring collaboration tools for people to use, right? How do I bring in like a WebEx or, Zoom-like capabilities? How do I bring in internal wikis so that people were getting used to using Wikipedia? How do we bring in internal wikis to an internal business and so forth? So a lot of those things are happening. You saw companies trying to build like internal corporate Second Life. You saw people trying to build internal corporate like social network, Facebooky sort of things and so forth. But all that was going on. So that period of time essentially was the period in which, the experience of the internet shifted from the only thing you do is retail buying transactions to really interesting sort of user interactions. Now, keep in mind, we went from 2000 to 2000 and almost 2008, and we still didn't really have the cloud, right? What we had was the emergence of what were called hosting service providers. And I put a link in the show notes. There were lots and lots of them. There were telephone companies that were offering services. There were, companies like the early Rackspaces and the early Savises and others that were offering hosting services. So essentially, like, we'll rent you a computer for a month, or we'll rent you a computer for a year, or a server for a year, right? So kind of the origins of hosting, but there was a whole bunch of them. There was 30, 40, 80, 100, lots of, kind of these hosting service providers that were figuring out, hey, people want to do stuff over the internet. They don't want to own computers. They don't want to run computers. So that went on. Then we get to 2006. AWS first launches for service being like S3. 2008, Microsoft launches Windows Azure. So the first Azure was essentially Windows-based for the most part. And then 2008, Google launches App Engine in beta. And I laugh about that because early in the day, Google used to make every service in beta for long periods of time, not your normal like 3 months, 6 months, but like years on end. So for example, Google launched App Engine in 2008. It didn't go GA until 2011. So they very much began to launch this idea that you essentially were their dev test. You were going to be testing their product. It allowed them to get fast feedback and fast iteration. They were able to put out features faster. And this began to create the mantra of, fail fast. Build things quickly, build minimum viable products, let the users sort of sort out the bugs, let the users sort of kind of tell you what features they want, which ones they prefer, and then you can allow your product to sort of evolve and be shaped based on real feedback versus just product managers just guessing or financial people just kind of telling you what to buy and what to do. So it definitely shaped a segment of the industry in terms of, how fast we built software, how we consumed software. And, the other thing is from a cloud perspective, from a cloud computing perspective, these things sort of came out of necessity, right? AWS came out of how to help initially the people that were beginning to sell products on AWS that weren't just AWS, right? So how do I host a web page, or how do I host a website or something like that? Obviously, it emerged and evolved into what AWS has become. But like the initial thought for the cloud was, let's hide all this infrastructure. Let's not, provide all these things, right? Amazon was sort of the only one at the time that took the approach of, we're just going to provide primitives. We're going to give you a computing service and a storage service and a database service. The rest of them, at least early on, Azure and Google, said, hey, let's skip all that stuff. Let's just focus on application developers. And they essentially, their first product for both of them was a PaaS service, going all the way back to 2008. So, 5, 6, 7 years before even the next generation of PaaSes came along, the OpenShifts and the Cloud Foundries and the app, what was previously Docker with .cloud and those types of things. So, there was a lot of very, very early learnings about cloud at the time. But again, cloud as we know it today, where you had primitives as opposed to just SaaS services, kind of didn't come out till almost the housing crash in 2008. So anyways, obviously you can go and read what happened, what led to the housing crash. Kind of didn't have that much to do with technology per se. There's a couple of good books and some links I put in the show notes about that. And then obviously 2007, the iPhone launches and Android launches in 2008, completely once again changes the paradigm. So we went from the pre-internet, pre-2000, sort of like, what is the internet? We had the sort of desktop internet, if you will, based on your sort of laptop or desktop, the web-based, browser-based internet from 2001 to 2010, roughly. And then the mobile internet obviously kicks off in 2007, 2008. So, we kind of had some overlapping periods there. But obviously once Android and the iPhone launch, all of a sudden it's like, the internet's in your pocket all the time. 24/7 computing becomes a mandatory thing for everything. And that sort of changes everything. So anyways, this was a period of time that, we learned a lot. As I kind of go through my, my sort of lessons learned, if you will, we very much had a period of time that people became kind of everybody, everybody who was working, everybody who was younger, but essentially working age people, became very tech savvy. You were having to do tech stuff at work. You were no longer doing stuff with paper. You were, everything was sort of digitized, if you will, sort of the first digital transformation, if you will. Lots of cloud services emerged. Obviously, we talked about it, cheaper OS, cheaper compute, cheaper bandwidth, allowed that to happen. It was mostly sort of hosted services. So it was sort of on demand, but not nearly as on demand as we saw today. SaaS became very normalized. SaaS became everything from business applications to consumer applications. It was able to do it with a better UI. They were able to sort of, create slicker, more interesting looking UIs, more flexible pricing. And they, were agile enough to sort of say, hey, there's a gap that IT doesn't provide. And we can start to fill in some of that gap and begin to make money. And so, they were making money sometimes through ads, but also through, sort of paid services that could be done outside of corporate IT. We talked a lot about some of the new technologies that emerged, scalable databases, open source becoming more widely used beyond just the operating system. Home wireless allowed you to work from home or, work after hours and sort of sit on your couch and surf the internet, but also, catch up on emails at the end of the day while you're having a glass of wine, whatever that might be. That began to happen. The other thing that happened around the home thing, and this didn't really materialize for a few more years till after that, was the companies that were building sort of the home internet types of technology. So the Linksys of the world began a model that really has kind of evolved today, or at least it did for about 10 or 15 years, what was called merchant silicon. And that was the idea that for networking technologies or security technologies, but especially networking technologies, you can do them with less expensive chipsets. So it doesn't have to be just built by a Cisco or just built by a Juniper or built by IBM or whoever it was. You could use kind of common off-the-shelf type of things. And this is where companies like Broadcom and lots of others started making their name. But essentially, they were coming from a consumer perspective to start with, but essentially they were building technology that could eventually get into enterprise products at a price that was 1/10, 1/20th what the custom silicon guys were building. So that was beginning to happen at that time. That obviously brought the cost of networking down. It allowed for much more flexible designs, and it's why we see Google building their own networking, and Azure and Amazon and Facebook and all these people. That all sort of began back in the early 2000s sort of timeframe. And then obviously, the biggest thing, bandwidth became cheap. There was a fire sale on bandwidth, which again sort of created this explosion of like I can put lots of services, and I can put video, and I can put large files for pictures and stuff that can be shared over the internet. But most importantly, advertising becoming the engine. The business model of the internet was the most important thing that came out of that. And obviously, Google made a tremendous amount of money. They essentially cornered the market on advertising. They still do. Facebook has sort of come in and been the second biggest player, but they essentially became a behemoth based on figuring out how to run two-sided markets for advertising, and that essentially became the fuel to allow almost everything on the internet to happen. So, really interesting time. Was a lot of startups that succeeded, a lot of startups that failed, but a lot of learning of what's possible on the internet, how do we make money on the internet, how do we scale the internet, all those types of things happen in about this 7 to 10 year period. So less boom, if you will. People started to normalize what was possible, and then obviously the housing market and the housing crash were sort of kind of independent things of technology. People were investing and over-investing in this bubble that was housing. But technology sort of built a foundation for what would be the future internet, the 2010s to 2020 internet, during about this 6 or 7 year period. So lots of interesting things that went on. I put a whole bunch of links in the show notes that are worth reading, some longer things and some shorter things and so forth. So anyways, hopefully these have been useful. We will get into in the next one kind of what happened after the housing bubble happened. A lot of really, really tight budgets for a few years, a lot of interesting changes to IT. It sort of became the beginning of the growth of cloud computing. As people were saying, hey, I can't afford to do a 5-year contract, a 3-year contract. I don't know what my revenues look like. It allowed the cloud providers who are well positioned, specifically AWS, to really take off. Obviously, the iPhone had a huge impact on what happened from 2007, 2008 as mobile bandwidth grew. And again, you see these trends start to happen, right? Internet bandwidth available, things happen. Mobile bandwidth available, things happen. So we'll really kind of dive into in the next one what happened from after the housing bubble. So let's call it 2009, 2010, all the way through kind of the COVID pandemic, because that was a period of time of incredibly low interest rates for very, very long periods of time, probably one of the longest we've seen. An amazing amount of open source taking off, some really interesting, kind of market and cloud interactions that we hadn't seen before. So we'll dive into all that in next week's show. But anyways, thank you all for listening. This is sort of we'll also dive into some of the OpenAI stuff as it starts to play out as we think about sort of the bigger impacts to AI. We'll get to that before the end of the year, definitely. So anyways, thank you for listening. Thank you everybody for sharing with us. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving, or that you've had a chance to reflect maybe on a long weekend about what you're thankful for. I know Aaron and I are both thankful to have family home. Good to see our kids home from college and so forth. Be good to be around friends and family for a few days, and looking forward to good health and a good wrap up to the end of 2023. So thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.